Welcome to today's Power Hour. This is Defensible Documentation, Building the Record Before You Need It. It's presented by Mitch Guimond of IRONWOOD Business Consulting. My name is Michaela Lavelle. I am the Director of Events here at the Blue Springs Chamber, and we are so happy to have you here with us today. A couple quick reminders. We have a Power Hour session scheduled every month for 2026. They are always at noon on the first Tuesday of the month via Zoom. We are also recording each session and adding them to our resource center. So if you miss one, you can go back and watch it later by logging into your member information center. Before we get started, please put your name and business or organization in the chat so that we can know who is here with us today. We will also be monitoring the chat for questions, and we will hold a Q&A portion at the end. All right. So today's presenter is Mitch Guimond. He is a human resources coordinator at IRONWOOD and brings over 8 years of human resources experience in the private sector. Prior to joining the IRONWOOD team, Mitch worked for 2 large international corporations within the security and tech industries. Mitch has experience within multiple facets of human resources, specializing in employee relations, investigations, compliance, ADA, FMLA, and training and development. Mitch has over 3 years of direct employee relations and investigative experience within both union and non-union environments. Mitch obtained a Bachelor of Science in Psychology from Washington State University in Pullman, Washington, is SHRM-CP certified, and is a licensed private investigator in the state of Texas. Mitch, we are so excited to have you here with us today. Are you ready to go ahead and present?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Michaela. And I'll go ahead and jump right into it. So today's topic is bulletproof documentation. Really, that's kind of your first line of defense for any sort of decision that the company makes. So we wanted to take the time to really dive into what that looks like, some of the best practices, and really kind of lay that groundwork for you guys so you can take that forward into your own organization. Before I do that, though, just a couple quick disclaimers. As a reminder, this is being recorded. So if you have any objections to being recorded, please reach out to the team over at Blue Springs. And then the other piece that I want to touch on is the content we're covering today is ultimately based on kind of current laws and best practices that are in place at the moment. As we've seen over the last couple of years, laws can change. So if you are encountering a situation, it's always a good idea to take some time, make sure that you're complying with the latest regulatory changes. And depending on the nature of the situation, especially if it's something that's particularly sticky, it may be beneficial to reach out and consult legal professionals. So with that said, if your documentation was reviewed tomorrow, would it protect you or expose you? Whether it's a dispute over a decision that the company's made or lawsuit or other situation along those lines, really your documentation is what's going to make or break your case. And I've seen it plenty of times where really strong documentation can take allegations that seem pretty substantial and refute them because everything was documented correctly. But I've also seen situations where even though on its surface, it looks like the company handled everything correctly, they didn't document it appropriately. And when allegations came down, the company had no way to refute the allegations. So really what kind of the core of this training today is going to be about is making sure that you're putting your company in the best position ahead of time, as opposed to you receive a complaint or a dispute or an allegation, and now you're on the back foot because nothing was documented. So we really want you to, or put you in a position where you can avoid finding out the importance of documentation the hard way. If you've caught any of my other presentations, you've probably heard me say document, document, document at least once. And that's really what the purpose of today's training is to drive that forward. So what we're going to be covering today is what bulletproof actually means. I know it can be kind of a buzzword sometimes, but really we want to break that down and give you a clear, practical definition, not just Hey, it sounds good on paper, so Mitch is using it, but really, what does bulletproof actually mean? We've got a four-part documentation framework in there that I'll be covering. It's a repeatable structure that you can train your supervisors, your managers, anyone who's dealing with those situations to help make sure that they're capturing the necessary information when documenting, whether it's an incident or a decision, making sure that everything is in there that you need. We're going to cover some of the common mistakes that we see. And then throughout this, I'm going to be trying to throw in real examples that you can hopefully carry forward immediately. So, why does this matter? Well, documentation is more than just an administrative formality. I hear a lot of times clients will reach out to us and say, "Oh, documentation takes time. Why does it matter?" Things like that. Well, at the end of the day, every time you make a consequential decision, whether that's to discipline somebody, terminate somebody, who gets written up, who doesn't get written up, layoffs, things of that nature, ultimately any of those can come into question. We live in a litigious society nowadays, and really having strong records are going to be the evidence that you're going to present to show, hey, everything we did was above board. So weak documentation often can mean losing those disputes that in theory should have been winnable if everything was done correctly. Additionally, having strong documentation increases your leadership credibility. At the end of the day, if you have clear documentation, that means that you have documentation you can look back at and maintain that precedence. So you can show that you're consistently making similar decisions based on similar information. So you're going to be more consistent across the board. So that's going to reinforce trust at every level. Employees also tend to trust fair, transparent documentation. So it'll signal that those decisions are grounded in facts. It's not the company playing favorites or somebody getting in their feelings, and that's why they got written up. It'll show clearly that, hey, a policy was violated, and that's why the decision was made. And it just helps ensure that operational consistency. So let's say you get into a situation I was in where there's a transition between employee relations staff. So when I transitioned into it, we lost the previous employee relations manager, but we had clear processes in place so that even though she took off, I still had everything I needed to continue that precedence and make sure that everything was consistent. If you're dealing with a union environment, that's going to be key because anytime there's a grievance, one of the things they look at is past precedents. So being able to maintain that continuity was huge in that situation. So what does bulletproof actually mean? Well, your evidence should be objective, consistent, timely, and clear enough that whatever documentation you have, especially your kind of final documentation, so for example, a disciplinary action or a termination summary, it should be able to stand by itself. It shouldn't need a ton of additional documentation to show, hey, we're painting part of the picture over here, but we need these 15 documents to really show it. Ideally, like anytime I'm writing an investigative summary, you should be able to read that investigation and know exactly what all we looked at, what all our findings were, and why we drew the conclusions that we did in that situation. And the way that we do that is we write everything to be objective. We're consistent across the board, and we make sure that it's done in a timely manner. That doesn't necessarily always mean, hey, an incident happens and it's written up the next day. You may need time to investigate. But what timely really means is you're not waiting months to draw a conclusion. You're not waiting months to investigate because memory degrades fast. I actually had an investigation a couple months ago where, had the claims been reported at the time, we could have potentially pulled video footage to prove or disprove certain allegations. Unfortunately, we weren't made aware of it. The investigation didn't start within a timely manner, getting referred to us. So, because of that, the video footage was no longer available. So, instead of having something that we could have easily proven or disproven based on video footage, it ended up being an inconclusive finding. So, that's really where that timely element comes into play. But when you're writing people up, again, you want to make sure that it's clear. So things like John Smith was late to work the other day and has missed a few days. That's really weak and doesn't really tell you what happened. Whereas if you say, hey, John Smith arrived at 9:45 a.m. for his 8 a.m. shift, and he was previously absent on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of May, didn't notify his supervisor, that's a lot clearer. And that can stand on its own as opposed to, oh, yeah, he was late. And then you need to also support that with his timesheet. So what bulletproof documentation is not? These are things that, if it's in your documentation, can potentially undermine it. So let's say you do receive a lawsuit or there's a dispute. If you start seeing this in the documentation, this is something that opposing counsel can look for, pick apart, and potentially use against your company. So if you have opinions in there that don't really have any sort of basis behind them, things like, oh, she has a bad attitude. Well, what does that really mean? Is there a policy being violated? Does it just mean they don't come in smiling and happy every day? It can look a lot different in those situations. So it becomes subjective. And if it can't be verified, it'll be challenged. Vague summaries. So performance has been an issue. Okay. How long has it been an issue? What's the actual issue? Is it something that's consequential, like, hey, they're making drastic mistakes on things that are a compliance requirement from a regulatory standpoint? Or is it, hey, their email signature, they're using an inappropriate font? So it can look a lot different, and that's where you want to make sure that you're clear with what you're actually communicating. Emotional reactions. I know we all get frustrated sometimes when you're dealing with employees, especially if you have kind of your frequent flyers, as I used to call them, where they come into my office. I've written them up 4 times in the last month or so. It's easy to get in that situation where you're like, this employee just isn't figuring it out. So then when you're writing your documentation of an incident or your disciplinary summary, the tone can kind of bleed over into that frustration a little bit. And then it's going to look like, oh, you were upset with the employee, and that's why you wrote them up instead of there being a factual basis behind it. So you always want to take a minute when you're writing documentation, whether that's a disciplinary, a term summary, investigation, you name it, and make sure that you're pulling that emotion out of it and make sure you're presenting and documenting the facts on it. I've even seen it in correspondence outside of investigative summaries. So clients, they're dealing with one of those employees that just gets under their skin and they send an email off that says, oh yeah, he's such a pain in the butt, and send something off, or more colorful than that. Well, anything in writing can be discoverable. So now, even if your documentation is strong, if you get subpoenaed, have to turn over those email records or your team's messages, and you've got messages like that where you're airing out your frustrations in writing, now you've got evidence to show, hey, maybe they don't like this employee and maybe they're just papering over what could be a further issue. And then we all know what happened. Things where you're just relying on institutional memory, or, oh yeah, everybody should remember this policy, or everybody knows this policy, even though it's not documented. Well, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So even though you may think everybody knows the expectations, you want to make sure that your policies are clear and your expectations are documented somewhere. That way, when it comes time to enforce them, you can point to the fact of, yes, everybody's held to the same standard. They received this policy document, they signed the acknowledgement, and everybody's on the same page. So, like I kind of touched on before, bad documentation doesn't just fail to protect you, it can actively work against you. Like I mentioned in that email example, correspondence where you're maybe bad mouthing an employee or things like that can be reframed as evidence of bias or discrimination or inconsistency, or even that the investigation was done in bad faith. Um, while the absence of documentation is absolutely a gap and means you may not be able to defend a decision, sloppy documentation can absolutely be weaponized against you, and neither is neutral. So, really, when you're crafting your documentation, you want to make sure that it's as clear as possible and unbiased as possible. One practice that I started doing, if I encounter a situation where I might be a little bit biased, is when I'm drafting it, I'll take names out of it. I'll draft it as complainant, accused, witness one, witness two, witness three, and so on. That way, when I'm writing it, it's not, oh, I'm looking into George Washington and John Smith and Jane Doe and these people. I'm looking at it from a purely neutral perspective, and then I can fill in that information at the end. So when you're documenting things, you really want to include a handful of key elements. We've identified 4 here, but you want the facts. So what actually happened? Get specific. Don't just say, hey, this employee was late. Say, hey, they came in at 9:45. The expectation was they were supposed to be there at 8 a.m. and they didn't call ahead. Or for performance, you don't want to say, oh, they're a bad employee. You want to say, hey, on this date, they made this mistake. This was the outcome of it. So you're presenting that in a clear, neutral perspective. You're not just saying, hey, they're terrible. You're giving evidence to show this is what took place. And you want to show how you're supporting that too. So if there's reports to show it, you want to point to the fact that, hey, we have an audit trail that uncovered it. There's video footage of it. The employee admitted to making the mistake, things like that. Context. So you want to point to what the actual policy, expectation, coaching, whatever kind of set that expectation was. You want to make that clear in there. So you don't just want to say, hey, the employee was late. That's a write-up. You want to say, hey, they violated our attendance policy. This is what it states. You're expected to be on time, ready to start your shift at the scheduled time. That way it's clear what that expectation is. You also want to include the impact. So what behavior or what did the behavior disrupt or endanger, or what was the outcome of it? If they make a mistake that ends up costing the company $20,000 from a regulatory agency, document that. If it delays a project, which impacts client relationships, document that. You don't just want to say, okay, this happened, but not outline the impact. And then you always want to outline what the next steps are. So what was done, what's coming next. So, hey, we counseled the employee, we reset expectations. Moving forward, they know that XYZ needs to be done. If they don't, additional corrective action up to and including termination will follow. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a 40-page report, but it should be clear what actions are being taken and how you drew those conclusions. So component one, these are your facts. Ultimately, that's really what everything else is going to rely on is factually what took place. So who was involved? What took place? When did it occur? Where did it occur? If you're just saying, oh, the employee was disrespectful during the meeting, that doesn't really give you any information. It says disrespectful, okay, maybe that was an issue. But if you're saying the employee said this is stupid during the all hands meeting on the 2nd, at approximately 10:15 a.m. in conference room B, there were 3 colleagues present. Witnesses corroborated that this was the remark that was made and that it created a disruption in the meeting. That's a lot stronger than just saying, oh, the employee was disrespectful. 'Cause disrespectful could be they rolled their eyes, they nodded off during the meeting, uh, could take a lot of different forms. Not all of those may necessarily be policy violations. Could be they didn't shake somebody's hand when they walked in, but they had a cold. So you want to be clear what those actions were. And the best way to do that is document it in a factual manner. So component two, that's your context. So you want to outline what policy was violated, what the expectations are, and if there's been any prior coachings or warnings. So I always recommend citing the specific policy or handbook section or code of conduct provision by name and section. I'll also include the page number a lot of times, just so that it's clear what the policy is that was violated. And then I always try to kind of briefly summarize what the expectation of that policy is if I can. So it'd be excessive absenteeism, because that's an easy one to write to. Hey, the expectation is that you're on time, ready to start your shift at your scheduled time. That way it's not just, oh, the employee was late, we're writing them up. It's clear, this is our attendance policy, this is what's violated. If there's something in their job description that they're not meeting performance standards, cite that specifically. That way it's clear what that bar is that the employee is trying to meet, and then you can outline how they're not meeting it. And then for prior coachings and warnings, if they've been trained on it or coached on it or they've been written up before, you always want to make sure that everything is documented and you want to outline that in your write-ups. So one practice that I started doing was anytime I'd be issuing a write-up, I'd double check for a prior disciplinary and I'd keep a list of the prior disciplinary on that write-up. That way, let's say they were issued a verbal for excessive absenteeism. They wouldn't have any prior disciplinary. Cool. But the next one, I would make sure that I'm documenting somewhere on there that they received that verbal warning on whatever date. for excessive absenteeism or whatever policy violation. When they receive their written final, I'd have the full list of their previous documentation there. And then what that does is it accomplishes two things. One, it helps kind of give you a quick summary of where they're at in the disciplinary process, because you can look at the most recent write-up and you'll have the full history there. But it's also huge when you get to that stage where you're looking at a possible termination, being able to show, yes, we did follow our progressive disciplinary process. More and more, when you're looking at terminations, whether that's from an unemployment standpoint or any other regulatory body investigating a termination, they do look for progressive disciplinary. So being able to show that throughout the process is going to be key. So the impact. So when a behavior occurs, there needs to be typically some sort of an outcome that's negative. There's plenty of situations where something may not, may or may not be a policy violation. And that's where you look at, okay, was there a disruption by that conduct? Did it create a safety or compliance risk? You know, something like, oh, they didn't say hi to me when they came in for work. Okay, is there a policy that speaks to that? Was it violated? Was it disruptive? Or was it a situation where the employee just was on the phone or busy or didn't feel like saying hi that morning? So that's really where you drill in on, okay, was there an impact to productivity, timeline, deliverables, customer outcomes, things like that. If there's no impact from it, it may not be a violation. So, for example, just saying, oh, George Washington was unsafe on a write-up. Well, that doesn't really give you any context. But if you say on February 2nd, he failed to ensure his load was secure while transporting chemicals, resulting in the load falling off the vehicle and creating a hazardous spill, that's a lot more detailed. It outlines what happened, what the impact was. The only piece missing in that brief summary is the actual context on it and the actions that were taken. So, as far as the actions taken, this is really where you close the loop. You've laid out your findings, you've laid out the impact to the company, you've laid out what the expectations are. This is where you close that loop with the employee and really drive home what the expectations are moving forward. So it could be something where you're having an informal or formal documented coaching. So you're saying who was present, what was discussed, what the employee acknowledged. It's always a good idea to have their signature on there. That way you can show the conversation did take place. If it's an informal coaching, what I'll typically do is send them an email afterwards just at recapping what the expectations are and what was discussed. That way there's at least some sort of a paper trail. I've lost count of how many times we've had clients reach out to us with, oh, we gave them a bunch of verbal warnings, but there's no paper trail on any of it. So now they're months down the road, they're frustrated with the employee, but they have no documentation to show what they've actually done to try and address the issue. From there, you'll typically move into your more formal warnings. This is where your progressive disciplinary policy comes in. So it could be a documented verbal warning, your first written warning, however many steps you have in there. But the biggest thing is making sure that when you get to that final warning, documenting it as a final warning. Because what that does is it shows that you're putting that employee on notice that any further violations could result in disciplinary action. But really what that does is that sets your expectations as you're documenting throughout the process is, hey, this is what you need to be doing moving forward. It's specific, it's measurable. You don't do that, there's going to be additional actions taken. And then when you finally get to that final warning, you can point back to all the different times you told them, hey, these are the expectations. Let's say you have a 3-step progressive disciplinary. Now you've got those 3 steps where you've outlined these are the expectations, you haven't met them. We tried again, you didn't meet them. Tried again, if it happens again, terminations to follow. So you're outlining those consequences in there as well. So again, if it's not focused on the facts, context, impact, and action, it's really not going to be defensible. So this isn't just something where, hey, you do the checklist once and hey, you're good to go. It's really a standard that you should strive to meet anytime you're documenting something. Early in my career, I got to the point where I was a little bit frustrated with my supervisors because they were delivering disciplinary actions that weren't really super defensible. I was dealing with a lot of grievances where just based on the documentation, we'd end up having to throw out the write-up because it wasn't clear facts are missing, policies are missing, things like that. So then what I did was I sat down with all my supervisors and trained everybody up on, hey, this is how it needs to look. If you're including a summary, you need to have the dates, who was involved, how it was substantiated, everything in a clear manner, previous disciplinaries on there, and gave them the chance to own that process. But every CCAR that we deliver still had to be reviewed by me. That way I could make sure, hey, here's the standard, you guys can write it, you can own the process. They have the freedom and leadership there, so they feel empowered. But on my end, I was making sure that it still met that standard across the board. And we went from probably about a 50% win rate on grievances to I think we're up at around 97, 98%. We had a handful that got thrown out on technicalities, but our ability to win grievances in that situation skyrocketed when we established that clear standard. So, got a quick scenario here if you guys want to try and jump in. Take a couple seconds, maybe a minute or so, and try to rewrite this scenario. So, the employee had bad attitude in a meeting. Feel free to make up kind of the timeline on it, but take a second and write that out. You know, who was there, what happened, when, where. Try to include direct quotes of how they had a bad attitude or examples of what that behavior looked like. What policy was violated? That may look differently at your company than somebody else's. What was the impact of it? And then what happened next? So I'll give you guys, yeah, we'll call it 90 seconds, give or take. I know I'm not giving you a ton of context on it because I didn't want to write it for you, but go ahead and take a stab at it. All right, and I'll give you guys another 30 seconds or so. Again, it doesn't need to be super detailed as far as writing out a full 40-page investigative report or anything like that. Just take a stab at identifying each of those four criteria and writing out a quick sentence or two. Perfect. Does anybody or is anybody willing to share the example that they wrote? So we can have you come off mute real quick. Or you can throw it in the chat if that's easier for you.
I feel like this is when it's really good to know what your policies are.
100%.
So I was thinking of a scenario, but then I was thinking, I got stuck on the part where you had to say what policy it was violating.
Mhm.
So
And that's pretty common. I actually ran into one with another client where they had a policy in their workplace conduct where, how is it worded? It was any conduct that was not in the best interest of the company, which in that case, I went back to them and I'm like, let's find a more specific policy because that could be anything. And how can you expect them to know what's truly in the best interest? They may have been acting in the best interest. But again, that's kind of where, while this is more focused on kind of the documenting of incidents and things like that, making sure that you have clear policies ahead of time is going to be huge in making sure that you can ultimately support your outcomes of any sort of incident or investigation. Um, so kind of as a scenario that we've got here, so remember the prompt was, well, you had a bad attitude. So during the weekly team meeting on the 2nd of May at 10 a.m., typically I'll write approximately just because it makes it a little bit stronger. But there were 6 team members and manager Jay Harris. The employee stated this is pointless when the project deadline was presented. The employee then disengaged from the discussion for the remainder of the agenda. So they checked out, they weren't engaged in the conversation. So per employee handbook, Section 3.2, workplace conduct. All employees are expected to engage constructively in team meetings and communicate disagreements through appropriate channels. So there's our context. We're just citing that policy, not just including what it is, but a quick summary of it. So the impact. The comment disrupted meeting flow, derailed the timeline discussion, and required the manager to regroup the team before continuing. This led to the meeting running approximately 15 minutes over schedule. So not only have we pinpointed the specific behavior, but we're also touching on how that actually impacted the meeting itself. So as far as action, the manager spoke with the employee privately after the meeting, reviewed conduct expectations, and confirmed understanding. The employee was reminded that continued conduct violations may result in formal disciplinary action. So we're starting with the incident that took place and detailing that, what policy was violated and the impact, and then what actions are being taken to fix the issue.
You make it sound so easy.
It just takes practice. I've written probably 1,000 of these at this point. But yeah, I mean, if you get into that habit of, okay, summarize the incident, what policy, what the impact was, sometimes I'll flip those two just so I can have impact because sometimes it flows a little bit easier. And then what actions are being taken afterwards. As you write more of them, it becomes kind of more natural. The other thing that I started doing when I was handling high volume of employee relations stuff was I had rough templates for things that were more common. So not doing your daily reports. Okay, that was a pretty common one. So I had a template in place there. Attendance issues. On this date, they were late. Previously, they were late on these 3 days. So I had all that kind of pre-filled out, and then I could update it to the specific scenario. Anytime you're delivering a disciplinary action, and that's a great question, Laura, you should have that discussion with the employee. If it's a formal disciplinary, I always recommend having them sign it. Make sure that it's clear on there that their signature is not an admission of guilt. It's just documenting that the conversation took place. That way you have it in writing that you discussed that concern, you've reset those expectations. So let's say the same thing happens again. Well, now you can point to the fact that on this date, you discussed it with them and reset those expectations so they can't come back and say, hey, I didn't know. I actually had a similar situation happen with falsification of timesheets. An employee, he was writing down that he was at work when he was calling out sick. So he was pre-filling out his timesheet at the beginning of the week and then called out sick. We caught it. He said, oh, nobody trained me on how to fill out my timesheet. So I brought him in, retrained him on it, delivered the disciplinary, he signed it. On that document, I outlined, hey, you were retrained on it, you know the expectations, you're supposed to fill it out day of. Well, about 2 months later, similar situation happened. He left early, but he filled out his timesheet saying he was there for the whole day. And when we're looking into that, we found about 5 or 6 more instances where he'd leave early, come in late, but he'd write down that he was there for his entire shift. Well, during my interview with him, he tried to state that, oh, I didn't know that that was the expectation. I was like, okay, well, here's the write-up from a month ago where you said, or where we discussed it, and you were retrained on it, and you knew the expectations then, so you can't really play that card. So even though he tried to grieve the separation in that situation, all of my documentation was in place, and it was a slam dunk where we were able to get that shut down pretty quickly. So some of the common mistakes we see. First up is vague language. That's probably the biggest one. Things like bad attitude, unprofessional, they're not a team player, poor communication skills, they're difficult to work with. Those are more conclusions. They're also opinions, and they don't really tell you anything about what the actual behavior is that's happening. Bad attitude could be they didn't say hi to somebody. It could be they had a grumpy expression on their face while talking to a customer. I had my receptionist, they tried to say he had a bad attitude just because he was very blunt, to the point, and direct with his communications. You'd reach out to him, hey, John, how's it going? And he'd be like, hey, how can I help you? That's just how he communicated. But it's not necessarily actionable. So you want to replace that with observable behavior. What did you see? What did you hear? What actually took place? So was it bad attitude? They were rolling their eyes and cussing out a manager, things like that. So you want to pinpoint what specifically took place. So the second mistake that we see a lot is inconsistency. So let's say you've got two employees. One of them, they're late 3 times, you write them up, and you're consistent with that. Well, you've got another employee that they're late 16 times, and you don't write them up, or you wait till that 16th time to write them up. Now you've got inconsistency between two employees. So if the employees become aware of that, on a lucky case, or if you're lucky, it's just going to be, hey, I feel like I wasn't treated fairly. And then you have to say, hey, there might have been additional factors, things like that, and try to justify your decision, but they're going to lose some of the trust they have for the company. But in a serious case, if you have those inconsistencies, it can look like discrimination because the employee can come back and say, oh, well, so and so was treated differently than I was. It must have been because of my race, my skin color, my age, my gender, any of the protected classes they want to come up with. And you may not have the documentation to support that. Similarly, selective documentation. If you wait until you have a problem employee to start documenting things, it's going to impact your ability to actually move forward with that because it's going to look like, oh, okay, you were tolerating that behavior for a long time. You didn't set your expectations early. And then if you have another employee that you're trying to be consistent with, it's going to erode your ability to do that and defend those decisions. So you want to make sure that you're consistent across the board. Try to apply that same standard to every employee in a similar situation every time. If there are exceptions, you want to make sure that you're documenting why that exception happens. If it's something where you're being a little bit more lenient with one employee, there should be a justifiable reason in there, and that should be outlined in your facts. So timing gaps. Why delays destroy credibility? Well, if you take forever to investigate, it can look, you may not be able to get the full information from them. Memories fade, evidence can sometimes be lost if you wait too long. Things like videos, typically they aren't saved forever. So if you catch it during that window and you start your investigation in a timely manner, you might be able to retrieve that. Too much time passes, it may no longer be available. Um, that said, if you can address it quickly, you can also make sure that, hey, we're course correcting quickly. It'll allow you to avoid those situations where, hey, you're investigating the first incident, now 5 more have happened. So if you can be timely in there, be timely. That said, if you do need time to investigate, make sure that you're doing a thorough investigation. That should prioritize the timeliness because you can always document that, hey, we waited to discipline until we completed a thorough investigation. So it's always better to be clear and be accurate versus rush something. But that said, you don't want to arbitrarily delay the situation either. Let's say you do have a situation where an incident happened months ago, you knew about it then, and now you're writing them up. Well, now suddenly anything that's happened between now and then is going to be considered. So let's say you knew about an incident back in January, you're deciding to write them up now. Well, last week they came to you with a complaint. Okay, now it's going to look like you're writing them up in retaliation as opposed to trying to address the concern. So you want to be mindful of things like that. So again, emotional tone was a big one that we touched on before. So the employee was completely out of line, her behavior was outrageous, clearly don't care about their job. These are just personal attacks, which aren't really assessments. That's more, hey, I'm upset, I'm angry, my feelings are hurt, what have you. And you're putting that on the page, and that doesn't sound neutral. In best case scenario, it just sounds like you had it out for the employee. In a worst case scenario, you had it out for that employee because of a protected reason or retaliation or things like that. So when you get frustrated like that, try to be mindful of it, catch yourself, and not let it bleed into your writing. Try to keep your language neutral. Another good practice that I've used is have a peer review. Because you can absolutely get into those situations where you're frustrated, you're not realizing you're putting it on the page, have somebody else take a look at it, and then be mindful of what you are putting in writing. Um, think about how your words would sound if they were read in a courtroom. I've seen plenty of times where company will be dealing with a particularly tough FMLA or ADA situation, and they'll send an email that they're voicing some of their frustrations with the employee's personality, but now that's on paper. So if they were ever subpoenaed, that's discoverable. Now, any decisions they make after that point, an attorney could absolutely use the kind of frustrated email to paint their actions that they take later. So mistake number 5 is they have that wrong focus. I mean, I was known as the Grim Reaper for a while just because all employees knew was Mitch is coming to write you up or possibly terminate you. Um, but the reason I bring that up is you don't always need to take that heavy-handed approach. If there's something like a small infraction, maybe you can have a verbal conversation with them the first time. Hey, make sure that you're putting your name on this report. Make sure that this is filled out correctly. Make sure that you're getting this to me in a timely manner. Things like that. Have that conversation. Maybe send them an email follow up to document it. But maybe that can fix the issue. That said, if the issue starts reoccurring and things like that, then you can move into your formal disciplinary. So it really depends on the situation, but it is really a balancing act. Not every situation means you need to drop the hammer immediately. But on the flip side, you can't ignore patterns either, where, oh, every week we're having the same verbal conversation where you need to do a little bit better, make sure that you're documenting incidents appropriately. If you start seeing those patterns, then you can pivot into, okay, tried coaching, that's not working. Let's move to something more formal. Um, again, you want to document those material issues, so things that affect performance, safety, culture, or compliance, and then be consistent across the board with how you treat all employees in those situations. So I've got a couple examples up here. First up, we've got this employee's late a lot. It's been an ongoing issue and needs to improve. Well, that doesn't tell us how frequently they're late, by how many minutes. Yes, we know it's an ongoing issue, but it really doesn't give us any context on it. However, on the flip side, we've got the employee will arrive late on April 12th by 12 minutes, April 18th, 10 minutes, and then April 25th by 18 minutes. We've got specific examples in there. Each instance was recorded by our time clock system. On April 26th, the manager reviewed the attendance policy with the employee. The employee acknowledged understanding and confirmed awareness that continued tardiness may result in formal disciplinary action. So that's a lot better. It's a lot clearer as far as what took place, what was violated, what the impact was, and what the expectations are moving forward. Here's an example of what that would look like on the performance side. So their work quality is poor. The employee needs to pay more attention to detail. Okay, against what standard? On which deliverables? Who reviewed it? So it leaves you with a lot more questions just based on kind of the 2 sentences that are there. Okay, their quality's poor. What does right look like in this situation? So the after result would be 3 consecutive reports were submitted by the employee on the 10th, the 15th, and 22nd of April that required revision due to data entry errors identified during the quality review. Each report was returned with written feedback. The errors required an average of 2 hours of manager revision time per submission. On April 23rd, the manager reviewed the accuracy expectations outlined in the roles performance standard. The employee acknowledged the feedback and committed a proofreading checklist before future submissions. So in this case, again, we're diving into the specifics of it. It's not just that their quality's poor and they need better attention to detail. We're outlining, hey, there were data entry errors that occurred that we detected, and it took 2 hours each time to fix. This is what the expectation is moving forward. This is what happens if you don't fix those expectations or start meeting those expectations. So it's really taking kind of the high level approach and really drilling down into those facts so that you can give a lot of context. But again, kind of circling back, a lot of people think, oh, it's so time consuming to document things. I mean, if you look at this, it's what, 4 sentences, maybe 5 sentences, but a whole lot stronger. So when does documentation matter most? Um, while good documentation across the board is always key, there are certain situations where it's going to be more essential to document things like safety incidents. So if there's a injury on the job or a near miss, making sure that you can document the incident that took place, what the investigation was, and what actions were taken to try and mitigate the reoccurrence of those are going to be huge if there's ever another incident and let's say OSHA comes in to investigate. If you can show that, hey, we were aware of an incident, we got it addressed, we fixed it, and then something else happens, that's going to look a lot better than, oh, yeah, we were aware of it back in March, we didn't do anything, and then an employee's injured in the same way. Things like complaints and investigations. You should always be documenting how you drew that conclusion in that situation. You know, if you receive a complaint from somebody, document what it was, document what actions were taken to address it. Um, I've seen plenty of times where a complaint comes in and a manager sits on it. And then a couple months later, suddenly what could have been addressed at the time is now a huge issue that's snowballed out because it looks like the manager was okay with the behavior that took place because they didn't do anything about it and didn't document the actions they took. So again, if you do receive a complaint, make sure that you're documenting it. If you're investigating a complaint, make sure that you're documenting it. That way you can show down the road, hey, it was handled appropriately at the time. Particularly with things like harassment, discrimination, things like that. If you can show that an investigation was done in a fair and impartial manner, you're setting yourself up for success if that's ever disputed. Um, Whereas if you don't investigate or don't document the investigation, you're going to have a hard time defending what actions you took. So disciplinary actions should always be documented, especially if they're formal disciplinary actions. Again, without that paper trail, how can you show that you followed progressive discipline? How can you show that a written final was delivered if there's no paper trail to show that a written final was delivered? You can say it was delivered, but you don't have any way to prove it. And then terminations are probably the highest stakes moment in any sort of employment process. A lot of the litigation and disputes, if you look at the history of them, whether that's discrimination, harassment, retaliation, vast majority of them, at some point in there, the employees let go. I've seen it plenty of times where, because I mean, if you think about it, the employee is losing their livelihood in that moment. You're giving them a reason to potentially hate the company because they're no longer a part of it. So you want to make sure that every termination, you've dotted your I's and crossed your T's. So it should be consistent with your past precedent, how you've approached it. If you follow progressive disciplinary, make sure that you're dotting your I's, crossing your T's, and you've hit all those steps in there. Or if you're skipping a step, you need to document why. Must be reasonable, must be well documented. At the end of the day, you don't ever want to get into a situation where you make a termination decision and you don't have the documentation to support it. Even in states where there's an at-will doctrine, I was always taught at-will means discrimination because if you're not providing them a reason, now the employee can come up with their own. And 9 times out of 10, they're going to say it was because they were treated differently. Even if you have a factual basis for it, you don't have the documentation, you can't refute that. So before you finalize anything from a documentation standpoint, it's always a good idea to kind of run through this 3-question test. If you can't answer yes to all 3, it's probably not ready. Would this document make sense in 6 months? So try to read through it with no context on it, or maybe ask a peer to read through it. Do they understand what's happening? Why it mattered? What was done? Or do you need to come in and explain everything to them? Here at Ironwood, anytime we're doing an investigation, we always have a couple peer reviewers come in. Typically, they're not involved in the investigation itself, so they can read it with fresh eyes and they'll catch a lot of things where, hey, I'm writing it, I'm in the thick of it, it makes sense to me, but they'll catch the things that maybe I didn't paint the full picture. And then it ultimately allows me to make a stronger report in those situations. Would a third party interpret it the same way? So when you're writing it, you're obviously writing it to support your decision that you're making. But do you think somebody else would read that and reach the same conclusion? Or is it vague enough or incomplete and can be spun a different way? Try to read through it, kind of play devil's advocate with yourself and see, okay, does this support my conclusion or does it support something else? And then does it show a pattern? So isolated incidents, they may not always justify significant action. Depends on the nature of what took place, obviously. But if you have a documented pattern, that may be reason for more severe steps or things like that. So if you've approached it in a similar manner in the past, and you can point to that, now you're going to be able to show that, hey, this decision was well reasoned. It wasn't just, hey, we made a snap decision to write this employee up or discipline him. We're just aligning with our past precedents and how we've approached similar situations. So I always recommend having a template in place for any sort of formal record. This is one format that works is you get your date, the employee's name, the issue that took place, your facts, the policy that were violated, the impact, the action, and then any next steps. For disciplinary, I highly recommend having kind of a standardized form for that, just because it streamlines everything and it helps maintain consistency. If you are using the same form and you establish that standard, your supervisors and your managers can start replicating and upholding that same standard moving forward. So, a couple kind of final takeaways. If it's not written, it didn't happen. So things like verbal conversations, informal understandings, or maybe institutional memory. Even if it's standard practice that you do things a certain way, if it's not written down, it's not going to protect you. So make sure it's documented somewhere. If it's vague, it's not going to hold up. So again, make sure that you're being clear with your facts that lead to your conclusions. So ultimately, you should have your facts and your summary of the incident, your ultimate findings of, hey, more than likely took place, and then what conclusions you drew based on that. Was a policy violated? Being specific is really what's going to make the difference between a record that's going to stand up or one that's going to crumble under that first question if it's ever questioned. And then again, you don't want to be inconsistent. It's going to create risk. So the selective documentation or discretionary documentation ultimately turns into discriminatory documentation. Even if your intent isn't there to discriminate, you always want to make sure that you're being consistent across the board with every employee in every similar situation. If you are deviating, you want to make sure that it's clear why there's a deviation. If you have two employees, one's asleep and the other one's asleep, you should approach it the same way unless you can clearly show, hey, this person was asleep behind the wheel of a vehicle, and then this one, they had their head down, but they were immediately responsive when somebody approached them. If you're going to take that sleeping versus appearance sleeping or appearance of sleeping approach. So again, that's really consistency is going to be the backbone of any sort of defensible HR operation. So before we dive into the Q&A, we've got time for scenario if anybody has one they'd want to run through, and we can kind of walk through how you document that. If not, we can jump right into Q&A. I know we've got about 5 minutes left. So we can go ahead and open up the floor for Q&A then.
Is there like a standard on how many times you should document something before action's taken, or is that something that you would just decide ahead of time and put in your policy manual?
As far as progressive disciplinary or progressive discipline goes, there's no set standard. Typically, you're at least going to want a verbal, written, and you always want a written final before your actual termination step. I've seen it anywhere from 3 steps to think we had 5 at my old company because we had verbal, 2 written, written final, and then termination. But I've seen some that are verbal, written final, termination. So it's really all about just kind of figuring out what sort of standard you want in there. Shorter windows, probably more of a hardline situation where maybe you're dealing with safety sensitive things or high compliance roles, whereas having more steps in there typically is more beneficial in situations where maybe you're dealing with uh, kind of a higher volume of employees, or you're in a situation where you need to make sure that you're retaining more employees. So I was in a high turnover industry where we had 5 write-ups, and I think a big part of that was, hey, we're high turnover. The industry average was about 6 months of employment. So we want to keep those employees as long as possible before we have to go out and try and recruit new ones. Any other questions?
I have a situation with a longtime employee whose performance is deteriorating. He has health issues with his back. He comes in late because of doctor's appointments, but he does let us know. His productivity has waned and his hours have been shortened. At this point now, he is the occurrence of the his work is happening, and we're at a point where we can't do this any longer. And the documentation piece is puzzling for us because we didn't document all of this deterioration through the last 12 to 16 months.
Mm-hmm. So what I've typically done in a situation like that where you've had a prolonged issue going on, um, you'll need to start somewhere. So that's when you kind of say, hey, we let the performance piece slide for a while, but we need to make sure that we're all operating from the same expectation. So you have kind of that verbal coaching to reset the expectations there. Now, in your case, I know you mentioned some health issues going on. So there's going to be some complications there from an ADA standpoint, possibly FMLA, depending on your company size. So it may be beneficial for us to kind of set up a call after this so we can talk through the situation more specifically. But kind of circling back to the documentation piece, anytime where you've kind of let the standards lax or essentially you've established a new standard by saying, hey, this is okay to come in late without notification, performance issues, things like that. You always want to make sure that you're resetting those expectations before you're holding people accountable to them.